The day Canada stopped asking permission. Something happened last week that American cable news completely buried, and once you understand what it actually means, you'll see why. Mark Carney just made Donald Trump irrelevant to Canadian economic planning, not temporarily, not as a bargaining chip, permanently. And he did it so calmly, so methodically, that Trump didn't even realize what was happening until it was already done. Let's back up. How this started. 3 weeks ago, Trump woke up at 3:47 in the morning, classic, and fired off a Truth Social post threatening 25% tariffs on everything Canada exports: lumber, oil, natural gas, electricity, steel, aluminum, everything. He called it a fair trade correction. He said Canada had been ripping off Americans for decades. And he ended with a word that will come to define this entire chapter of North American history. He said Canada would beg, beg. So what did Mark Carney do? Nothing. For 48 hours, Ottawa went completely quiet. No emergency press conferences, no panicked statements, no visible chaos, just silence. And then, 2 days later, Carney delivered a 6-minute address so composed, so surgically precise, that Trump deleted his original post within 2 hours of watching it. Carney said Canada had modeled every tariff scenario imaginable, that contingency plans had been in development since 2016, that if the United States chose economic confrontation, Canada would not retaliate. It would simply move forward, without them, not against America, without America. That distinction is everything. What Trump didn't know. Here's what happens when you threaten a country without reading the briefing first. Canada supplies 31% of American oil imports, right now, today. While gas prices are already painful in most of the country, Trump just threatened to tariff the single largest source of fuel keeping American engines running. 60% of electricity in the northern United States, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, flows from Canadian hydroelectric infrastructure. These are swing states. These are voters, and Canada controls their light switches. 43% of prescription drugs purchased by Americans in border states come from Canadian pharmacies, because the same medications cost 3 to 4 times more from American distributors. Trump's tariff proposal would hit insulin. He would be taxing insulin that diabetics in Montana literally cannot otherwise afford. And then there's the card Carney has been holding in reserve, waiting for exactly the right moment. Canada produces 17% of the world's uranium. Nuclear power, the energy source that Republicans have been championing as America's clean future, runs on uranium. American reactors cannot be built or refueled without it, and Canada controls the supply. Trump knows none of this, not because it's secret, but because he doesn't read intelligence briefings that don't flatter him. The moves Carney made. While Trump was posting at 4 a.m., Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, personally boarded a plane to Ottawa. Not a video call, not a diplomatic envoy. She flew there herself. When reporters asked why she was prioritizing Canada over 6 other ongoing negotiations, she said Canada was about to become the most important trading partner the EU has in North America. In North America, not the Western Hemisphere. In North America. She was telling the world that the United States had been reassigned. They signed a preliminary agreement on March 9th, creating a transatlantic rare earth supply chain that deliberately routes around American and Chinese involvement. Canada has massive untapped mineral deposits in its northern territories. Europe has the green processing infrastructure. Together, they're building a technology supply chain that makes both of them independent of both Washington and Beijing. Trump handed China's rivals and America's closest allies to each other on a silver platter because he wanted to look dominant on social media. Then came Mexico. President Claudia Sheinbaum, who took office just last October, whom Trump assumed would be easy to intimidate, flew to Toronto on March 14th. Not Ottawa, Toronto. She met Carney at a private residence for 11 hours with no press present. 11 hours. When they emerged, they announced the Great Lakes Trade Corridor, a logistics network using Canadian rail to move Mexican goods to Canadian Atlantic ports, shipping to Europe and Asia without crossing American soil at any point. Mexico gets Atlantic access without Gulf bottlenecks. Canada gets manufacturing partnerships replacing American contracts. The United States loses approximately $40 billion in annual logistics revenue and gains nothing. Trump called Sheinbaum the next day. He posted about it. According to his own account, she told him Mexico needed to diversify for economic security. In diplomatic language, that means, we don't trust you and we're done pretending that we do. The Sovereignty Framework. On March 20th, while Trump was on a golf course, Carney stood before Parliament and announced what he called the Sovereignty Framework. 5 pillars, each one specifically engineered to make American economic leverage disappear. Pillar 1, Energy. Canada will now prioritize domestic consumption and strategic allies, Europe and Asia, over American exports. If the U.S. wants Canadian oil, gas, or electricity, it pays a 30% premium index directly to American tariff rates. Trump wants to charge Canada 25%. Canada charges America 30%. And because American Midwest refineries were built specifically for Canadian heavy crude, they cannot simply switch suppliers without spending approximately $200 billion rebuilding refinery infrastructure. That money doesn't exist. Pillar 2, Pharmaceuticals. Canada is restricting bulk drug exports to American distributors. Individual Americans with valid prescriptions can still access Canadian pharmacies. But the wholesale pipeline feeding American distribution networks is shutting down. That production is being redirected to universal healthcare systems in Europe and Commonwealth countries. Millions of Americans are about to discover what their own pharmaceutical industry actually charges without the Canadian alternative keeping prices honest. Pillar 3, Manufacturing. Canada is committing $70 billion to joint ventures with Mexican manufacturers, auto parts, electronics, textiles. Supply chains that used to crisscross North American borders now stop at the Canadian-American line. Pillar 4, Mineral Rights. All Canadian rare earth minerals are now classified as strategic national resources, exportable only to countries with signed reciprocal agreements. The EU, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, and Indonesia are on the list. The United States is not. Neither is China. Pillar 5, Digital Sovereignty. Data generated by Canadian citizens or on Canadian soil must be stored on Canadian servers. American tech companies lose access to 40 million high-income consumers unless they comply with Canadian infrastructure requirements. Silicon Valley's assumption that the internet runs through American pipes is being quietly dismantled. Trump's response. At 6:43 that evening, Trump posted a response so disconnected from reality that his own press secretary declined to read it aloud at the briefing. He said Canada was weak, that they had no military and no power, that they would come crawling back in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. It has now been 72 hours since that post. The Canadian dollar is up 4% against the US dollar. The Toronto Stock Exchange hit a record high. Applications for Canadian permanent residency from American citizens have increased by 900%. Americans are moving toward Canada because they trust Carney's economic plan more than Trump's instincts. The bigger picture. There's one more layer here that hasn't received attention. The day before Carney's speech, he had an unscheduled phone call with the Australian Prime Minister. No press notice. We only know because Australian journalists reported it. The topic, according to those reports, was coordinated resource policy among Commonwealth nations. Australia controls 28% of global lithium production. Canada controls 17% of uranium. Together with New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and potentially India, which has been quietly signaling interest in Commonwealth trade revival, You have an economic alliance that controls the materials necessary for green energy, nuclear power, and advanced technology manufacturing, and the United States would be outside of it. Trump has spent years obsessing over China while completely missing the possibility that America's own allies might build a separate system and simply not include Washington. Meanwhile, Canadian polling shows 87% public support for the sovereignty framework. In a country where 60% constitutes a landslide, 87% is a national consensus. Cities that historically disagree on everything, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, are unified. A video of a Tim Hortons employee in Edmonton refusing service to a customer in a MAGA hat went viral. The company released a statement supporting the employee's right to express Canadian pride. This is a nation that has been accommodating and differential for its entire modern history, and it has collectively decided it's finished. What this means for Americans. If you live in any northern state, electricity costs are going up. Replacing Canadian hydroelectric power requires either years of new construction or purchasing from more expensive alternative sources. If you drive, gas prices are increasing. Midwest refineries cannot simply switch to a different grade of crude without massive capital investment. If you take prescription medication, prepare for sticker shock. When bulk Canadian exports stop, American pharmaceutical companies set the price. The difference is 300–400%. If you work in manufacturing, your supply chains are about to become slower and more expensive. Integrated North American production depends on components crossing borders repeatedly during assembly. When those borders become barriers, costs compound at every stage. And if you are young, if you are looking ahead and trying to decide where to build a life, Canada just became demonstrably more stable, more affordable in healthcare, and more strategically confident than the United States. Trump isn't just losing a trade dispute, he's driving American talent northward and doesn't appear to notice. The real question. Here's what nobody in American media wants to say plainly. What if Canada is right? What if the trade relationship was always more beneficial to the United States than American politicians acknowledged? What if Canadian cooperation was a choice that got mistaken for an obligation? What if decades of taking that cooperation for granted finally produced exactly this outcome? Carney isn't being aggressive. He's being assertive. The difference matters. Aggression is unprovoked. Assertiveness is what happens after you've watched your boundaries violated repeatedly and finally decided to hold them. Trump called Canada weak. Since that post, their currency strengthened, their stock market set records, and their citizens rallied behind their government in numbers that American politicians haven't seen in a generation. That's not weakness. That's what competent governance under pressure actually looks like. Trump set a 2-week deadline. He said Canada would be begging by April 4th. Mark your calendar. When that date arrives, check which side is calling for negotiations, whether it's Ottawa or whether it's American governors, senators, and business leaders quietly reaching out because their constituents are furious and their supply chains are fracturing. Because based on every data point available right now, it won't be Canada making that call. The unipolar moment in North America is over. That's not a catastrophe. It's an adjustment. The question is whether American leadership is capable of adjusting, or whether it will keep threatening countries that have already decided they don't need permission to move on.